So thank you so much, and let me introduce the last session of the day, which is a wonderful panel talking about balancing a life. Bachi Karkaria, Jatindra Nayak, and Khushwant Singh talk about how they write biographies and whether a biography can at all be objective. They will be in conversation with Sashmi Nayak. Sashmi was my batchmate in college, so one of the great discoveries I made over the last few months is that Sashmi lives in Bhubaneswar now, and she's going to be an integral part of the Bhubaneswar Literary Meet family from here on. So over to you, Sashmi, and I'd like all the panelists to please come on stage.
We have with us a very distinguished panel of guests today to discuss about objectivity in biographical writing. Of course, Bachi Karkaria needs no introduction. We are all too familiar with your Sunday column. She's also a biographer, and so is Mr. Khushwant Singh, a columnist, a biographer, and a novelist. We have Professor Jatindra Nayak, who is an authority in all matters concerning English, and we shall be turning to him very often in this session for his expert comments. So in this session, we shall be exploring how the authors have attempted to be objective in their biographical writing. We shall explore your books together, and I would turn to Professor Nayak to interpret and relate it to theory if necessary and if possible. So let's begin with the jacket of your books. That speaks so much to the buyer. Could you tell us the story behind the jacket? Khushwant.
Well, we were looking for a picture where he had, he was dressed in this manner, and I found this in a frame actually, and we used it. So there were other pictures of him in action in terms of his work or, his life as a horse rider, a polo player. But I think this kind of gave the regalia because being an erstwhile royal. So this picture gave that regalia. There's a sword, there is an achkan, there are these buttons, and there's this. So I think that's why we use this. And it was a high resolution one.
Yes, and I'm quite curious that you call him the People's Maharaja. Almost like the People's Princess when she was not royalty, HRH anymore. She called herself the People's Princess. And here is another Maharaja who doesn't have his title, of course. And did you choose to call him People's Maharaja for that reason?
No, because of his popularity.
Okay.
Because he was popular, and this biography actually was released before the results of the 2017 election, and he became the chief minister then. So that means that his popularity at that time was very high.
Peak, yes.
Was at its peak. So actually I started it, this was a working title, but then I think the publishers liked this title and they kept this.
Bachi, about your book, Capture the Dream.
So you want me to answer the same question?
I think it's not working. Yeah, the same question, please. How did the cover come about?
Yeah. Well, the cover is, we don't have the Oberoi cover, but we can show you this one. And I can tell you that when the publisher first put forward this cover, everybody who I showed it to said, it's a disaster, it's doomed from the start. Any cover that is black never succeeds in the, in the market. And I was also a bit upset because the interesting thing about Captain Krishnan Nair was his sheer flamboyance. We've got, where we talk about him as a man, there's a chapter there which is Trailblazer in green blazers. And, he really was, he wore canary yellow jackets, but of course, bought from the most expensive stores in America. And so I said, why this man in this sober pinstripe suit? But then I think the publishers also got a bit of cold feet, and they added a lot of this gold to it, which has made the whole cover lift up quite a lot. You asked me about the title. It's not at all the title that I liked at all. And that was actually not at all the title that I liked about Dare to Dream, because for Dare to Dream, I had really thought I would have something like peacocks for breakfast, because he lived on this farm surrounded by peacocks. And for this man, I wanted something like curry and caviar, because even though he was such a citizen of the world, he was so rooted in his Kerala soil. But the family somehow didn't, or the other alternative was for guest and country, because he was really the one hotelier who wanted to seriously showcase the country.
Okay.
The tradition, the heritage, plus the fact that this was a future-ready country. So all his hotels are patterned on the ambience or the heritage of the cities in which they are.
Yeah.
And so I thought that would be a good headline, good title. But for some reason, the family turned it down, and the book was already getting so delayed. It was necessary to be there for his. Centenary. So I said, to hell with it. And in a really strange way, one book is called Dare to Dream, the other is called Capture the Dream.
Yeah.
And like there really should have been no connection.
Well, sir, I would like you to take a very careful look at both the jackets, and that's why I was passing the book on to you. The biography on Captain Amarinder Singh says an authorized version. And this one says in that little sticker there, true story. So when I just want you to reflect on that. Authorized version. Does it sound objective to you? And in fact, true story. Implying almost that there are other versions of the story.
I think the whole question of objectivity in biographies or autobiographies is a vexed one. In any case, I think the biographers never get a good press. Everybody is suspicious of a biographer. Suppose somebody wants to write my biography, I would be very, very wary, I would be very, very frightened. In any case, I think people were always hostile to biographers. Tennyson said that biographers are carrion vultures, preying on the secrets of a person's life.
Yes.
Henry James burnt all his letters so that his biographers will not find anything about his life. And George Eliot said it's the disease of English literature. Biography is the disease of English literature. And Germaine Greer, this famous feminist, she went to the other extreme. She said that biography is the rape of a person. So biography has always been treated with suspicion, bordering on hostility. But at the same time, biography is one of the most fascinating literary forms. I can't even I can keep myself away from a good biography. I think I avidly read biographies and autobiographies. And the whole question of objective, how far can we take this question? Because we are not dealing with only facts. We are dealing with the interpretations of those facts.
Yes.
And the moment we reach the realm of interpretation, objectivity takes the back seat.
True.
Nothing, even scientists no longer talk about objectivity in that kind of absolute sense. So I think they have done a commendable job. I envy them. I wish I were a biographer. So.
Well, there's time.
I think there's a differentiation. What we understand is that there are profiles and there are biographies. So a lot of people the biographies that we see are largely profiles and they're not biographies. So once you get into, so every account of a life is not a biography. I mean, these are mere profiles. I think that's where the difference is, and people or the media or the critiques at some time fail to understand this little differentiation.
And you said all these terrible things about biographers and biographies.
Oh, I didn't
but,
say that.
but yes, okay, you quoted them,
Yes.
which sort of made me squirm a bit. But it actually, in fact, it's very often the opposite criticism. They think that when you've written a biography, especially by, authorized is actually not really a very fair word, because authorized automatically has a degree of
Collusion.
pejorative,
There's a collusion between the
they will
writer.
say all the nice things about us. But that's not at all true, I think, biographers are always mistaken to be hagiographers, and I think you would like to say something there. And I have also said here that a halo is absolutely not the must-have accessory of a biography. Because unless you kind of really talk of warts and all, and by warts and all I don't mean dirt, I really don't mean pus, I mean give an objective, fair analysis of the person that you are writing on.
Thank you. Well,
I would like to add here with the word authorized means actually, I think it's a great way to write a biography because you get access to not only to the person but to a person like him, to so many documents, to so much of library materials, to so much of so it your interpretations, actually it helps you in your own interpretations, absolutely.
well, it is said that the biographer confronts not one life, but two. One is the subject that others see, the social, historical person and his achievements, attributes, etc. And the other is your own singular mind that filters, assesses, interprets, and presents. How did you handle this process of judging your subject and determining which events to include in the book? Bachi, you write in the acknowledgement, it was a collaborative democracy and not a dictatorship filtered through a single mind. So I want you to speak first and then I'll come to Khushwant.
Yes, Sashmi, I'm glad you quoted that because that's really the distinction I make between fiction and non-fiction. Because fiction is really filtered through a single mind. And a biography is really a democracy where you're talking about the whole cast of characters who go on to make up the subject of your biography. And I would say that, here it actually depends, since our subject is objectivity, I think really what is the object or what is the objective really of the biography that you're writing? Are you setting out to create a scandal sheet? Are you setting out to dig out all the dirt you can? Or are you setting out to talk about, like in both cases, these were both great hoteliers. M.S. Oberoi was actually the father of innkeeping in India. He was the man whose he was really the only, even J.R.D. Tata said, he is the only exclusive hotelier of the country. Because the Tatas had other empires as well. Captain Nayak came to hoteliering at age 60. At a time when people are hanging up their boots, he was cobbling together an entirely new profession and entirely new industry. And he came from a very successful textile career. He was earlier in the army, which is why he continued with this captain, even though he was in the army for a very short time, but he continued to keep the title of captain. So I think the idea was to present two hoteliers or two individuals who took their lives, changed the lives of many people, and how did they go about doing it. With Rai Bahadur M.S. Oberoi, it really was a history of hoteliering in India. Right from the old Raj days, the Simla hotels, the associated chain of hotels which he acquired with a lot of subterfuge and a lot of, backhandedness, but with not really backstabbing. There's a difference. There's a difference between backstabbing and backhandedness. Backhandedness is part of corporate empire. It's like tax avoidance and tax evasion. One is legit, the other is not, right? And so, so you then kind of just go ahead with that. With Capture the Dream, it was how can a man build that many careers? How can he be so very versatile? And what I think is really the lovely thing about Captain Nayar's book are the amazing stories that go into this man's life. Every hotel was a story of despair and devastation, and yet it became a success. With Oberoi, every global or national or personal,
your mic has stopped working.
Personal misfortune. No, gone.
Sometimes it works and sometimes.
Okay. So with M.S. Oberoi, every successful hotel or every success of his was built on some misfortune.
So you decided on just keeping the success stories. I mean, the question was, how did you decide on what to keep and what not to keep in the biography?
I think you just keep the interesting bits.
Okay.
Because see, I'm not a corporate writer.
That says it all.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to move to Khushwant. Khushwant, you say that in the course of your interviews with Captain Amarinder Singh, you found him to emerge as a model for a dispassionate biography. You go on to explain that it was because of an obligation he felt towards history and towards a biographer. That he was frank and did not seek adulation or any insertion or deletion, and yet he did flag certain events and issues. Why and when would he do that?
So when he did flag those issues, I mean more to do with dates or some. For example, there is this incident where he's studying in Sanar, and one of his classmates said, then suddenly there was this Cadillac that would come in, and the dicky would open, and there used to be Coca-Cola and all that would come in. And so what he flagged was, with his hands he's written that Coca-Cola was brought to India by my father. So these kind of things, or a certain point where the dates mismatched, or where the perception about his resignation after 1984. So, what the media said and how, the resignation happened. So maybe these points on minor issues as such. But he never asked for any addition or deletion. And why I say that he felt this responsibility, because he himself is a historian. Yes. He's written 4 or 5 books. And the Kargil War and Last Sunset. He's the biographer of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's military acumen. So he kind of understood that space. Yes. And I think that was a very welcome step.
Yeah. Well,
and I think I'll share. So initially, when we set in, there was this conversation, and I told him that, basically in a biography, when you're writing a biography, a life is already set. What I'm doing is basically researching. And if there is any deletion which is very obvious, why would anyone believe the rest of the biography? It's a very simple math when you're writing a biography, So these were some of the discussions, when to lead towards objectivity.
Sir, most postmodern historians believe that true objectivity is theoretically not possible, as every individual has a viewpoint, that the time period and the culture that you are born into automatically eliminates any possibility of objectivity. So how does one attempt objectivity in biographical writing?
I have already made it clear that absolute objectivity can never be the goal of any form of storytelling. After all, biography is a life story. You are constructing the story of a life. The moment you are constructing a narrative, the question of point of view comes, heroes and villains come, emphasis comes, selection of facts come. So obviously in a story, in a narrative, you cannot aim at complete objectivity. And there's nothing called complete objectivity. Nowadays people are talking about intersubjectivity. It's one mind exploring another mind, or one life used to explore another life. The other thing you can attempt, to achieve is detachment. So I will give you the example of, say, this canonical biography written by Dr. S. Gopal of his father, Radhakrishnan. His son writing the biography of the father. Extremely difficult to be objective. The tendency to worship him, tendency to adore him, present him as the greatest human being or philosopher will be irresistible. But see what he does, the detachment. He presents him as a very worldly man. He talks about his shortcomings as a husband, shortcomings as a father, and at the same time highlights his great qualities. So whenever you are trying to throw light on some life, light, remember, never forget, light also casts a shadow. So all great autobiographies should bother about that shadow.
So actually detachment also can create a problem, because then detachment, or you go to a point where you actually overlook some qualities also, so I think that was a challenge which I faced also during that you sometimes...
I'll be asking you a question on detachment.
Let me just add, I think in the cases of our two distinguished guests, they have a serious problem as biographers. They face a serious problem because they are dealing with living people.
Yeah.
When you write the biography, like a translator, as a translator, I always think that the best author is a dead author. He won't quarrel with you. It's like for a biographer, the best subject is a dead person.
He was dead.
And sometimes even when they're dead, their relatives can create problems. So they should be safely dead, a century ago or something like that. So I congratulate them on taking such wonderful, great risks.
Well, both these biographies are very well researched and contextualized, both historically, geographically, and even politically. What were the research methods that you used? Any significant historical document or family archives or even other biographies of other contemporaries, and how did you validate them? How did you evaluate and validate them? Yeah. Bachi, just wanted to, push you a little further. You couldn't interview Captain Nayar's wife or him. Yes. But you did down the generations.
Yes.
And I'm reminded of the late Queen's, palace put out a statement when her grandson Harry did a interview with Oprah. And she said, some recollections may vary. Did you face any of these intergenerational, variation of recollections?
No. Yes and no. Yes and no. Well, in the sense that with Captain Nayar, I mean, the family's recollections were, I had to sort of quite take them at face value. But more than the family, I mean, I got a lot more of my work and a lot more of my material from interviewing staff, because, especially when you were writing about the hotels, because, how did he build? Remember, this is a man who entered the field. He was a Johnny-come-lately. He was really the arriviste, and he was challenging the aristocrats of the industry, the Taj and the Oberois. And so how did he manage to hold his own? And I think that was a very fascinating part of this biography. I had actually got, even though he was dead, I had got his Malayalam autobiography, which was both an advantage and a major disadvantage. Because Captain Nayar, being the flamboyant, egotistic man that he was, I mean, every line of his autobiography had to be checked. I mean, the timelines were haywire. They were like, but at the same time, there were, 2 or 3 stories there which were just, whether they were true or not, they were great stories. For instance, the fact that he was this really, boy from a backward village, and he was in the school because his mother managed to put him into the school of the Chirakkal Raja. And the first year the Raja came on the annual day, and this boy was so stunned by this character who seems to have descended straight from the gods, that he just found himself propelled to the stage and rattled off a paean of praise. And the Raja was so chuffed that he said, I will pay for your education for the rest of your life. So, this is a fantastic story. I had no way, neither from the Chirakkal Raja nor from anybody else, but it's a great story. And sometimes the great story allows you that poetic license.
Khushwant?
For me, there's a lot of research in this book. So family documents, they had a governess, Mrs. Here Dayal. So they didn't know the family. She had actually written about 20 pages. She had written about 20 pages maybe as a memoir, so she wanted to write, where she has described the royal children, and she was hired to teach. So that document was the first document that I got, and it's a beautiful document where she's, explained Amarinder's handicap as a young boy, that everyone is out to please him, how a youngster will be able to develop the differentiation between a stupid act and, so all that. And then his school library, the Doon School file, I mean, the letters written to his mother, his father, his school records, the failures, but also adulation for his athletics and his how money was brought to buy alcohol. So all that, the entire school file. Then that is one part of it. Then obviously interview with his mother, his family, his own. I have 100 hours of recording with him. And then, but I had to walk a very tightrope, because the large part of the book where it becomes very important is when he was part of the secret talks as Mrs. Gandhi's emissary with Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. And those are out of conversations, the white paper, the biographies of Arjun Singh as governor, the biography of P.C. Alexander, who was the principal secretary to the Prime Minister, and then his army life interviewing, then the NDA files. So huge access to, and the palace Rojnamcha they call it, that's the daily diary. So they have, so basically they used to record the minutes of the day till 1947. So the day he was born, so I got that entire thing. How many gun salutes were given, how many bhogs were there, how much of food was distributed. It's all recorded. Noor Jahan danced. She was 14. So all this is all mentioned in their records. So I got access to all that, yes.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's the difference between writing the biography of a man of such privilege, where every step and every breath is recorded, and two people who really came out of nowhere and built. And it is amazing, really, how little respect people have for archival material. This hotel, the Grand Hotel, I first actually wrote on the Grand Hotel, and then M.S. Oberoi said, I want her to write my story. And there were no menus even. There weren't even menus. I had to go to collectors who then gave me menus. But the wonderful thing is that, because we were talking about Raj Simla, we were talking about Raj Calcutta, and, my favorite line really is that nostalgia is the longest surviving industry of Calcutta. And so there were lots of nostalgia and lots of archives on the Raj. So those, I think, were for me really, it was even one of the compulsions of writing the first book on the Grand, that can I write on the life and times of Calcutta?
Professor Nayak. Yeah, got it. Professor Nayak, a narrator is in dialogue with the archive of memories. Not only the subjects, but also others, family, friends, colleagues, and many others. What are the constraints in this dialogue? And then we find in both the books, that we are discussing today, references to other biographies. How does one determine objectivity in this multiplicity of stories?
Well, I think autobiographies, biographies, all forms of life writing, actually, their raw material is memory. And memory is, I think, extremely slippery. People have talked about the inadequate and adequate treason of memory. Memory constantly betrays us. Even an accident takes place right in front of two people's eyes, and when they narrate the accident, you will have totally two different versions of it. So memory is extremely tricky. And it requires great skill on the part of the biographers to deal with this slipperiness of memory. So, and I think the other important thing which concerns us when we look at biographies is that they are stories of life. No matter how much research you have put into it, it's actually these two distinguished biographers are actually great storytellers. It's not the research which distinguishes this. For instance, Michael Holroyd has written this canonical biography of Bernard Shaw, 4 volumes. one volume is full of footnotes. Nobody bothers about that. Ultimately, it's readable. People read it because it's a fascinating story. So these people have ultimately constructed a captivating narrative. And the memory, and they have to deal with something extremely slippery, extremely unreliable as memory. And our memories don't match. That's why when you compare two biographies of the same person, they differ. Because our memories don't match. And the other thing is, the biographer's autobiographies also interfere with. I'm sure in these two autobiographies, you can find somewhere in the shadows the autobiography of Mr. Singh and Mrs. Karkaria. However, self-effacing or invisible, they try to make themselves become.
Well,
I have another very favorite quote about when you said the treason of memory, the selective amnesia of memory. And that is really true. What you said was really true. And, sorry.
Well, memory researchers argue that remembering is reinterpretation of the past in the present. It is not just a retrieval of a file from memory. Rather, there is a creation of meaning in the act of remembering. And this keeps changing over time, and so there are discrepancies. Khushwant, how did you deal with conflicting memories? Did you take it to the Maharaja? Or did you take a decision based on other considerations?
So, yeah. So, God.
Something's wrong with you.
Hello.
Microphones are unreliable.
Hello. Yeah. So, I think for me, every word uttered by the protagonist, obviously it's from the memory. I have corroborated it with some document or some other individual or some book or an academic setup. I have corroborated everything. In fact, once the biography was released, there was no critique or there was no one who challenged any fact or anything. Once it was reviewed, it was this thing, but there was no, anything that came out where the facts were mismatched. So a lot of research happened on that. I would corroborate everything, every date, every instance, every anecdote is largely corroborated at some point. Because I've written a biography of Fauja Singh, the oldest marathon runner. So he had no memory, he had no idea of dates.
I would agree and not agree as well that yes, I think a large part of your effort is really checking and rechecking. And I actually think that's really part of your job as a journalist. That you're trained to check and recheck. And at least journalists as existed in my time. I don't know about today. But my conundrum really was too much of a memory which I was not able to use. Okay, so this is the story, the great love story of Rai Bahadur M.S. Oberoi and his long-time mistress Nirlep Kaur. Okay, everybody knew about it. It was like the worst kept secret of Delhi. And he kept, that is not in the book. It's sort of glossed over, but in a very, very discreet and whitewashed and, Bowdlerized kind of fashion. Because Nirlep Kaur happened to be the wife of the owner of the Imperial Hotel. And one of the biggest legal battles that he fought was when the Imperial Hotel decided to terminate his lease. And he was this lion in summer, determined to kind of wreak vengeance on these, people. But the thing is that then Nirlep Kaur became, where our biographies somehow ran on parallel lines, when Nirlep Kaur became a very strong member of the Khalistan movement, and she was involved, in that whole business of Operation Blue Star, or where Operation Blue Star went against it, and the Golden Temple. And her family got really upset when they knew that this biography of M.S. Oberoi was being written and that what would be written about their mother. And so they said that, look, you can't put in anything. And it was really unfair because I'm not that kind of journalist who was going to, put a scandal sheet. I mean, he had a lot of respect as his mistress, and his wife had a lot of respect as his wife. But he kept on, this thing went back and forth. No, you can't. Then he said, ultimately, there are death threats against me by the past Khalistani people, and so please don't, include it. So now I couldn't be responsible for a death threat of a man who was already 90 years old. And yet, Nirlep Kaur was the most abiding memory that he talked about. I mean, I would go to him after doing all my interviews during the day, and in the afternoon I would go to his farm, and I would have sent him a list of questions. He would have answers to all of them by memory, very often in, even in the order in which I'd asked them. But they would be to the point. But when it came to Nirlep Kaur, this 90-year-old man, ridden by a stroke, rheumy eyes, his eyes would light up. He would almost, sort of become a teenager, describing all kinds of fascinating things about his affair with Nirlep Kaur, and that I would, bring her. He remembered the perfume that he would bring. He would remember the mithai that she would bring. He remembered the 2 bungalows they built on opposite sides.
You had to keep all this out.
I had to keep it all out. And it was wonderful. I mean, it was sad. Because each time he would send the portrait of Nirlep Kaur to the publisher. And each time he would call for it back. And he'd say, Nirlep came to me in my dream. This is this 90-year-old man, huh? Nirlep came to me in my dream. And I kind of would try my journalistic tricks and say, well, she was such an important part of your life, and now you're keeping her out of your biography. But it didn't work, and it was like really sad. It was really sad.
Well, narrating life stories, both of you do very skillfully and with much eloquence. Did you go through any anxieties, biographical anxieties, of how should you construct the narrative? How did you, select the events and shape the life out of these, sources and stories and interviews? What were your challenges?
My only anxiety was the night before the book was to be launched, because it had so much. It had, it had so much of critique about him and people around him, his coterie, his chief minister tenure, though he himself had gone through. I still get, people come and tell me that, someone called me, we were going to the court. And also it dealt, a large part dealt with the Punjab problem of that time. So one didn't know, where, what would go. So there is this particular incident where he talks that he had organized the surrender of one of the militants and taken them to Chandrasekhar when he was the Prime Minister. And later on, he came to know that 22 people, all of them were eliminated. So these were the kind of incidents that the book carries. So I was kind of anxious that where, how things are going to come, once they're in public domain, how these things. That was my anxiety. Writing-wise, I was very confident that whatever will come in my domain of information, it will be in the book. I was very confident, and so was he. He realized that, this is the way he'll go about it.
Well, if I may just return to Nirlep Kaur, I mean, I knew that all Delhi knew about it, and I kept telling him, I said, look, if we include it, it doesn't take away anything from the life that you have lived and the contribution that you have made. But if we leave it out, that will become the first point that will be criticized about the book, and that will hijack the book. In the same way that sometimes controversies at Lit Fest hijack a Lit Fest, right? And all the other speakers then, kind of fade into the background. And that's exactly what happened. The first review that came said, it doesn't have the most important part. It doesn't have Nirlep Kaur. Okay, let's put that aside. For me, the real challenge was actually the finance part, because this man had kind of just gone haywire with his ambition, and then built up this 300,000 crore debt. And so he kept thinking that, oh, I'll manage. I'll be able to call in favors, with the government. I have kept all kinds of politicians happy. And, and his own personal flamboyance, his own personal style, kind of allowed him to get away with murder, if you like, the murder of finances. But ultimately, that did not happen. And it was, as I write in the book, that it was a combination of Shakespeare and Yeats, that, from Macbeth, of vaulting ambition, which overleaps itself, combined with things fall apart, the center does not hold. So this was this man's vaulting ambition, and then the center not holding was the collapse of the Lehman Brothers, the terrorist attack on Mumbai, all kinds of things, which is why when he thought that his foreign currency bonds would be, his stocks were like the highest in the industry. And yet 10 years later, this man was forced to sell, or his family was forced to sell. So the finances and the minutiae of all this kind of became a really big challenge for me. And they had promised that they would give me the note, on how this whole debt restructuring happened. And that was holding up everything because nobody was coming up with that document. So finally, I sat with the person who was actually, I was dealing with, liaising with the most, Rajiv Kaul. He had sat with his finance people, created the Excel sheet, and then I sat down with him, point by point, and said, well, can I put it this way? Can I put it that way? And in that sense, I think, again, it's journalistic training, because you are writing, you're a jack of all trades and master of none. So you're writing on all kinds of subjects. One day on AIDS, one period on AIDS, one period on civil aviation. So you do have a lot of technical information which you must learn without compromising.
I have a small follow-up question. And that is, both of you are good fiction writers. Did you employ any techniques of fiction writing? Did you borrow any techniques such as, very dramatic contexts, climaxes, and all these things that are usually, written in a novel or in a story? Did you use any of those in the biography to make it, readable, interesting?
I guess that's your writing skill, whether you're, writing a novel or a biography for that. So, I mean, I really can't, because after that, there is this whole process of editing also that takes place. So, which, does cut down on, those that kind of a narrative, if there is any. So, I got a very good editor in Ravi from Hay House. Why I say good, was the way he edited, but he had also done a lot of political biographies before. So that way, we were very hands-on. But yeah, but it's a skill. I think you're right.
Professor Nayak, there are times when some bits of the biography is sometimes imagined to give it context or to make it look complete and more authentic. For example, the internal conversation that the protagonist has with himself. And Bachi has employed this, this method of Captain Krishna Nayak talking to himself. What would you say about this tool?
I think I would answer this question in a very general way, because no specific answer is either possible or desirable. I think at the end of the day, I think biography is the celebration of the uniqueness of an individual. That we all are unique individuals. So this uniqueness comes across in all good biographies. The other thing is, this is also a celebration of the different ways, innumerable ways in which the same life can be written about. So, many techniques are possible, many ways of narrating that life, constructing that life is possible, and the aim should be to communicate the uniqueness of the individual and leave open the possibility of that life being written about in many other ways. I think that's my take on this.
I'll just, I'll let
First
you.
of all, I am not a fiction writer,
Okay.
unless you talk of journalism as fiction, as very often as hello.
Great extent.
And but I think it really is, a story well told.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it is the art of storytelling.
I'm
Anybody
coming
can
back
write
to
that
you.
story,
I'm coming
but
back to you, Bachi. Theorists like Richard Ellman. Theorists like Richard Ellman and Goffing, they describe individual lives as constructed performance, played out in public, shaped by choices and functions. Goffing talks about impression management. Do you think, Bachi, biographies hold the secret to understanding public performance and its relationship to social life? Or is it just another exercise in impression management?
This is the trouble with having an academic as a moderator. It is extremely unnerving, and I'm reminded of a piece of verse about Shakespeare which said, I dreamt last night that Shakespeare's ghost appeared for the civil service post. Shakespeare, I fear, did rather badly. 'Tis said he hadn't studied Bradley. And it's really, now you've put me on the back foot.
That's not my intention. These biographies that you have written, and you've interacted with these, great people and their children and grandchildren. Do you think that they were managing, the impression or the memory of their grandfather or, of their father? What did you think? What was the purpose of these biographies? Of these businessmen.
See, the Rai Bahadur biography was written as part of the business biographies series that Penguin had just launched upon. But because I was not a business writer, I wrote it as, I think, a good journalist or a good storyteller, which is why I remember the second mistress, actually, of Rai Bahadur, who was his chief housekeeper, and she said, हमने तो बहुत biography पढ़ी है, लेकिन ये तो novel जैसे लगती है. So I consider that a great compliment, because it had the technique of the novel writer without taking liberties with facts. And at the same time, sometimes, like, not about these biographies or even these biographies, but the book that I wrote in between on the Nanavati case, the twists and turns, an extramarital affair, which ends up, creating great, leaps of large seminal questions. So I remember quoting Tom Wolfe, who said the trouble with fiction is that it has to be plausible. And I found that the trouble with non-fiction also, is that it sometimes sounds implausible. Fact being stranger than fiction. So I don't think that any of the family members were trying to create a hagiography of either of these two gentlemen. There were two brothers in the case of Captain Nair, who came from two different spaces, and I was able to kind of find a balance between them. In the case of Rai Bahadur, his older, much more flamboyant son Tiki was dead, and Bicky, who was much more down to earth and I think maybe suffered very much from the second son complex, was not doing any great favors to his father. So I think that no, there weren't any great performances which were trying to subvert the fact or the narrative. And ultimately, I keep coming back to this point, that it is really a story well told.
For me, it was exactly the opposite challenge, because the family was wary of that book by Germany Das on Maharaja Bhupinder Singh. So they, at some stage, I thought that they felt that this might just end up something like that. So the family was very, the immediate family didn't talk to me first. Then finally I had to convince his daughter that it's very important that you talk, and in their personal space also, Amrinder, had differences with his, spouse. So that was difficult. So for me, it was, they had no control, or they were trying to control because they were not talking. And maybe that was the way to control from their end, because that way. But yeah, sorry. No. So I had the other issue. So there was really no one who was trying to create an impression or anything. People were very honest and upright. The impression people with the ones who were said to gain from being close to him, maybe, but that you discounted and you understood from where they were coming from.
You know, there is a fundamental question on how important is truth in biographical discourse. And Mark Twain called it a species of damned lies. Others say that even if it is inaccurate, it is a characterization by the author and so should not be discredited. Professor Nayak, what is your stand on this? How should a biography be read? Should it be left to the reader to adjust expectations?
I think reader is always the boss, so we can dictate terms to. But about truth, I have something very interesting to say. I will simply quote Aneurin Bevan, who was the architect of the National Health Service. So someone, actually he said that, well, I have my daily dose of fiction from newspapers. I don't read novels. So he said that when somebody talked about truth, he said, give me your truth, I'll give you mine. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we're left with interpretation of facts. It's your truth versus mine, and we have to accept that. And the provisionality of all biographies, that another person will write another kind of biography. So there is nothing called absolute truth, and we have to recognize the relativity of.
So we have
so
to read.
I worked on a different way. I took the philosophical side to it, that can only be one truth. If it's not, then it's not truth. Then it's a duality. So I try to, with that particular thought, interpretation can be different, but truth remains the same. I think there cannot be two truths.
I think we're doing a bit of a disservice to biographies by so questioning truth, because I think that all right, truth in my view is there in both the books, and I think one is it verifiable? Is it something that you've got records? And of course there are always records which also differ, because, and I'll again tell you a big failing of journalists, that journalists keep looking at one set of facts, and they never go further back, and they don't ask the next question. And if you actually ask the next question, the answer can be quite the opposite. So the laziness in journalism is really where I say, guilty as charged. But I think everything here can be corroborated, and also that when you have got a wider picture of the man, and the fact that you have not been able to verify in black and white, if that fits into the larger picture, then yes, I will put it in.
Did writing these biographies... Okay, we'll just... Very quick answers. Did writing these biographies have any impact on you? Khushwant, you say that I'm a changed person after completing this book. Did you ever think that this would question your neutrality?
Changed, when I say, maybe there's a perspective, to it. This is, so changed means that, you, for example, when writing Fauja Singh's biography, I walk 6 kilometers every day after writing his biography. So I'm a changed person in that manner. So I think there are certain things which we pick up which help us in our day-to-day life. Maybe I picked up simply how to say a better cheers or raise a toast, So these are the things which you
said that you mentioned that I have learned not to reject anything, but to reflect on it, or something like that. It's a positive change.
Yeah. So maybe
not
yes.
a negative one.
So change. I think maybe I meant that to accept that, to allow every information to come in, and then kind of go through it rather than react on perception or something. So that's a better change, maybe, to...
So this brings us to the issue of detachment again, Do they need to be detached from their subjects to be objective? and to be considered as neutral and authentic and the rest of it?
Like Khushwant said, I think detachment can have different implications, but one must recognize that there are facts, and these facts must be interpreted, and the process of interpretation will go on, and there is no final picture, and we keep looking for other shades of meaning, other ways of looking at things. So recognition of this, I think, is something that reading biographies, I'm not a biographer, but at least I read a lot of biographies. They allow me access to another mode of consciousness. And in that sense, it expands my consciousness. Other ways of being, other ways of thought, other ways of feeling, and other ways of looking at the world. So it's an enriching experience. Whoever writes a biography deserves my gratitude.
So I think that's what I write. While it may not be immediately apparent to the reader, writing this book has enriched me in more ways than one. Crafting a narrative as monumental as this was akin to weaving a tapestry from the multi-threads of royalty, history, legacy, intrigue, politics, military and literature, which led to immense learning and a profoundly gratifying and humbling experience.
Yes. You also mentioned that I had to keep Captain Amarinder Singh at arm's length so that the biography did not suffer from hagiography. Were you afraid of being compromised at some time?
Not really. What I write is to highlight a quality that he...
you found him extremely charming and...
Yeah, which he is. So you have to distance yourself, that detachment. So it's a constant, this thing, because... like the other day when we had the book launch, so there was this young woman, she was 34, and he was at 75 at that age. He says, I mean, now I realize that why, women just have to get charmed by him. Mm-hmm. So one consciously, it's a biographer's, this thing that you tell yourself that, if there is anything like that happening, that there is a relationship building, you please detach yourself and come back and start fresh.
Bachi, did you have similar concerns? I must point out you've given Captain Nair the best description, and the most desirable traits. He had panache, he had presence of mind, intelligence, everything. So.
Oh, but he also had, look at the mess he made of his empire after all that, so there the detachment. And I think I must confess that, he could charm a bird off a tree. And if he had been alive, certainly I think keeping that distance. But I think that, detachment is one word, but I think a biographer must have empathy. If he or she starts off on a hostile note, then I don't think that is fair.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, Barry.
No, I just want to say, yeah, go ahead. Somebody? I just want to say that it's been absolutely fascinating. I didn't believe that such a subject would keep a person who has not had his usual siesta awake. But amazing, these three persons, and of course the moderator. Professor Nayak, I'm here, Professor. I'm here. I have never heard theory being told in such a story.
Thank you.
So you should actually think of writing the biography of somebody, because you just made theory, which I hated and still dislike, so interesting every time you took the mic. So thank you. I'm coming to your question also very quickly. Bachi, of course, nothing to say except that, goodness me, she can tell a story. Not fiction, but she makes non-fiction a story, which is a great, great talent and skill. And I'm hearing Khushwant for the first time, and I think, especially the little bit he read, I'm just going to devour his book. But I want to ask the three of you, and something that you said. Sir, Professor, would you write a biography, which I think you should, and where you have to maybe compromise if somebody's had an affair and their family doesn't want that to come out? Bachi, would you ever write again a biography where they ask you to keep something out? Or will you ever write your own biography or your autobiography where you'll mention everything that people asked you to keep out? And finally, Khushwant, I want to ask you, would Amrinder Singh or anyone else that you write about, would you write the biography if they told you to keep the affair out, if there was such an affair?
Well, shall I take the question? So I've mentioned everything. So I've mentioned everything.
I know, but in another biography, they told you.
No, I would not. I would not. I would not agree to that.
I know Jerry has been hounding me to write my own story. And, I think I would leave out a lot of my personal life because, again, as I say, what is the objective of the book? I think the objective of a book that people are asking me to write is that because through all the years that I've lived through journalism and the times that I've lived through, the areas that I've written on, which were pretty seminal, whether it was AIDS, where I was really the first journalist to be recording it in such depth, the very fact that I brought urban stories to page one and realized the importance of city stories in people's lives, the feminist movement, the whole change in media, that I've seen. I come from, my grandfather started a paper, and when my parents were editing it, it was hand setting. And today I'm in the world of digital journalism. So the whole media morphosis, I think that would be the objective of my story. I think that is what would bring value to my book, not the niggardly, sordid details of my life. And I would keep them out because I do have family, I do have children, and I do have a sensitivity towards their feelings.
So Mr. Oberoi was right.
If I ever get to write a biography, I'll try to be a very compassionate biographer because I'm full of limitations and will forgive the limitations of my subject.
We have a question there.
My question is somewhat similar to what the other gentleman asked. Obviously, it was clear that when you're writing a biography, sir, you are not writing entirely, you are generally under pressure to omit certain things. And whether you celebrate the uniqueness, as you said, or some of the early writers who have narrated in the Dr. Jatindra, Nayak, as he said, people are distrustful, earlier writers were distrustful. But ultimately, when we get the right to see what the person reads, does he really get to know the overall, the correct image of the person, or is it compromised to some extent, and what the writer writes, we get to know only that part?
No, I don't think, really, I think, if you leave out, very often you have to leave out things because of the sheer length. I know that when I was writing Dare to Dream, I dropped 30% of what I originally started writing. Capture the Dream, I was supposed to write, 40,000 words. I ended up writing 65,000 words, and a whole lot was also edited out. Because I am also an editor. I have spent, 11 of my most formative journalism years on the desk. And I today truly believe that there's no copy in the world that will not improve with cutting, So yes, we leave out things for various reasons. But net, I think the basic honesty that have you presented the character who, okay, apart from little, either chota mota, 19-20 का फर्क, net, you have presented the character as the world has seen him or her and as you have seen him or her. So that prism has to be very fair. Have I answered it?
Yeah, okay.
So, final words. We should read biographies for what they do, not for what they are, and the impact that it's going to have to our own personal lives. With these words, thank you so much, Bachi, Khushwant, Professor Nayak, and of course, Malavika and the Tata Lit team. Thank you so much.